Indigenous elders in Gippsland are upset because the Allen government is using their local language to name the state's proposed Indigenous representative body, essentially their voice to Parliament. It already exists, but they want to enshrine it in law. But they didn't ask the elders for permission before they used their language. In fact, Kurnai elder Auntie Cheryl Drayton told the Sunday Herald Sun today that not only were the traditional owners never consulted on the use of their language, they're actually opposed to the body entirely. She said there was no consent given, but they're doing it anyway, and they're just being very disrespectful. And of course, the treaty bill was introduced to Parliament last month, and it's set to be debated in the coming weeks. I mean, isn't this proof, Joe, of what happens when you try too hard to be woke? You always slip up somewhere, and you never actually end up being as virtuous as you claim you are.
Yeah, I think it also speaks to something even more sort of endemic in this debate, which is a disconnect between Indigenous people out in the sort of more rural and regional communities and a sort of Indigenous activist base in the cities, which is driving a lot of these things. And so I'm not surprised. Strangely enough, I actually, just a few weeks ago, had a very profound encounter with a member of the Gippsland Indigenous community, which I won't go into. But I just remember talking to him about what we were talking about, just how completely separate it is from, say, you know, what you'll hear Lydia Thorpe banging on about, or indeed, and again, I supported the Yes campaign, but as soon as I saw the way it was being talked about and some of the voices and faces behind it and what they were saying, I thought, this looks like just another campus exercise of the inner city left. It doesn't actually look like this profound thing that it was supposed to be. And I think that's what Auntie Cheryl is saying. I think that she's saying, this has got nothing to do with us. You're so ignorant of actual Indigenous culture that you don't even have the decency to ask us if you can use our language to do it or what we think about it. And it doesn't surprise me at all. So I'm with the Gippslanders on this one.
Yeah, look, I think they've got a fair point. I mean, if the state government rolls in and says, you know, we'll use your traditional language, you should be privileged that we're using your language. We don't want this thing. Why are you using our language? I think it proves, as we often have with the Australia Day debate. We'll talk a bit more about the general history of this in a minute. But it's not really about actually doing anything good or decent for Aboriginal people. It is correct. Yeah. Correct. Because if you really cared, you'd take the time to say, how would you feel about using your language to front this thing up, wouldn't you?
Yeah, of course you would. And Joe's point is well taken. There's no evidence that Victorian Aboriginal people want this. There are about 70,000 Aboriginal people in Victoria, about 1% of the population. A bit more than 90% of them are, in fact, fully integrated into the society and doing as well or as badly, it's Victoria, as all the other Victorians. And there's no evidence that a majority of them want to be treated any differently from any other Victorians. So this is something being imposed on them by an inner city elite, which they don't want. And what's being imposed is actually a very nasty thing. There's a name for it. It's called systemic racism. Now, we've never had that in Australia before. People have claimed we have, but it's not true. I mean, Tony Abbott's book, which we'll talk about later in the documentary series here on Sky, demonstrates there's been no systemic racism. Some nasty black pages of interracial violence, but from 1788, everyone on this continent, every Aboriginal person was automatically made a British subject, a subject of His Majesty King George III with legal status, which is why white men could be and were prosecuted and hanged for killing a black man. So there's never been systemic, and that violence was never approved of by governments. What Jacinta Allen is planning to do is to legislate systemic racism. Now, can I read you the Oxford Dictionary's definition? Systemic racism is unequal treatment on the basis of membership of a particular racial group. That's what she wants to do. And we think, oh, it can't be racist, she's trying to be nice to them. There are two kinds of racism. There's repressive racism and benevolent racism. And they are both as offensive, they are both as patronising, they're both as divisive as each other. And to legislate divisive, systemic racism makes this the most shameful piece of legislation, surely, in any parliament ever.
And the Australian people, when they've had the chance at the ballot box to give their voice against racism, have done so in great numbers. Yeah. We had a referendum in the 60s to prove that.
Yep.
And Evelyn, I think this shows just how fraught the whole idea of setting up a statewide or even a nationwide, eventually, treaty is. Because one of the reasons, I believe, that there was never a treaty in this country is, of course, you weren't just dealing with one group in Australia on this land. There were hundreds of Aboriginal countries to deal with. And so if you are trying to have a statewide treaty that is supposedly going to deal with all of these different groups in Victoria, all of whom have different issues and different histories and different languages and their own different cultures, it's almost the greatest example of the white man trying to take control by saying all of you have to abide by this one treaty as though it's going to work. It's never going to work.
I think that's why they've stopped teaching history in schools, well, history properly anyway, because if you do, like you mentioned, actually understand history, you will know that when, you know, we came to Australia, there were so many different groups of Indigenous people who were living very differently from one another with different languages, with different structures. And so you're right, when something like this comes along, how do you fit everybody in one box? That's the problem. And anything that has nations within nations, which is what this treaty represents, is literally cause for like civil war. Like, and I'm not saying that we're going to be, you know, like the American ones, but in terms of division, in terms of, you know, being incapable of living amongst one another, this is exactly how you stoke that, by telling different people based on their race they get to live differently. And this is part of what a lot of the people in the No campaign were saying during the recent referendum, which was that the vote, the voice to Parliament, was a segue into the treaty. And if you actually read the documents that the treaty, the people behind the treaty put forward, and if you actually read it properly from cover to back, it's quite scary, some of the things that were proposed in that. And so those of us in the No campaign who actually foresaw the trajectory of where it was going. First, it would be the voice, then it would be the treaty. This is not really a surprise because we did see this coming. And, I think that it's worth people at home reading the treaty, what's being proposed, because, like I said, nations within nations is never, ever going to work. And division in our country right now, at a time where we need to be unified together, it shouldn't be tolerated, especially from the politicians who are supposed to have our best interests at heart.
And so it's meant to be about reconciliation, and reconciliation, as I understand it, means you reconcile something and you come together and you settle your differences and you become one moving forward. And so much of this, it seems to me, actually creates more division than it fixes.